The sun hung heavy over Los Angeles, its rays baking the asphalt of the Sunset Strip into a shimmering haze that blurred the edges of the world. The air was thick, humid, and smelled faintly of exhaust and fried food from the taco stand across the street. The Strip was alive, as it always was, a pulsing artery of the city where dreams and desperation collided in a cacophony of sound and color. Tourists in flip-flops snapped photos of the neon signs, locals hustled past with purpose, and street performers staked their claims on cracked sidewalks, each one vying for a moment of attention. At the corner of Sunset and Vine, outside a dive bar called the Rusty Anchor, a skinny teenager sat cross-legged on a tattered blanket, his back pressed against a graffiti-scarred brick wall. His name was Ethan Parker. Though everyone on the street called him Stringer, a nod to the way his fingers danced across the frayed strings of his battered guitar, the instrument was a relic, its wood chipped and scratched, the varnish worn thin from years of use. But in Ethan's hands, it was a lifeline. He was 16, though he looked younger, his frame small and wiry, his dark hair falling in unwashed waves past his shoulders. His clothes, a faded Black Sabbath t-shirt and jeans 2 sizes too big, hung loosely, patched together with safety pins and hope. In front of him, an open guitar case held a scattering of coins and a single crumpled dollar bill, the day's meager earnings. Ethan's eyes were half closed as he strummed the opening chords of Ozzy Osbourne's Crazy Train, his voice rising above the chatter of the crowd, raw and unpolished but laced with a haunting intensity that made passers-by pause. "All aboard," he sang, his voice cracking with emotion, each note carrying the weight of a life that had already seen too much. The lyrics poured out of him, not just sung but lived, every word a piece of the pain he'd carried since he was old enough to remember. Ethan had been on the streets for nearly a year, ever since his mother vanished one night, leaving behind a note that said, "I can't do this anymore." He'd been 12 when she started slipping away, lost to addiction and despair, and by 16, he was alone, bouncing through foster homes that never felt like home. The guitar was his only constant, a gift from a foster mom who thought it might keep him out of trouble. She hadn't known it would become his salvation. The one thing that kept him tethered to something bigger than the hunger in his stomach or the ache in his chest. On the Strip, Ethan was just another busker, but when he sang, he was something else entirely. A voice that could stop time, if only for a moment. The crowd around him was small but growing, a mix of curious tourists and jaded locals who'd heard 1,000 street performers but lingered for this one. A woman in a sundress tossed a quarter into his case, her toddler clapping along to the rhythm. A man in a business suit slowed his stride, his earbuds dangling as he listened. Ethan didn't see them. Not really. His world was the music, the way the chords vibrated through his fingers, the way the lyrics let him say things he could never speak aloud. "Mental wounds not healing," he sang, his voice dipping low. Rough with the kind of sorrow that didn't need an audience to feel real. He'd learned to sing like this in the quiet moments, alone in alleyways or under overpasses, when the world was asleep, and he could let the pain spill out without anyone watching. Music was his confession, his prayer, his way of making sense of a life that had never made sense. He didn't know that today. Someone was listening who would change everything. Across the street, a man in a black hoodie stood in the shadow of a record store awning, his head tilted as he watched the kid on the sidewalk. The hood obscured his face, but there was no mistaking the way he carried himself. Shoulders slightly hunched, hands shoved deep in his pockets, as if he could shrink into the background despite the aura that clung to him. Ozzy Osbourne was no stranger to the Sunset Strip. He'd walked these streets in the '70s, back when Black Sabbath was rewriting the rules of rock, and later when his solo career turned him into a legend. Now he was here again, not as the Prince of Darkness, but as a man wrestling with his own shadows. Ozzy was in a rough patch, the kind that came with too many late nights, too many bottles, too many questions about who he was when the stage lights went out. He'd slipped out of his hotel that afternoon. No entourage, no security, just a pair of dark sunglasses and a need to walk, to feel the city's pulse and maybe find something to quiet the noise in his head. He hadn't expected to find it in a kid with a guitar. Ozzy stopped when he heard the first notes of Crazy Train, his own song, carried on a voice that hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the familiarity of the melody, it was the way the kid sang it, like he'd lived every lyric, like he knew what it was to be derailed, to be lost in a world that didn't care. Ozzy edged closer, blending into the small crowd, his hood pulled low. Ethan's voice was raw, unpolished, but it had something Ozzy hadn't heard in years. Truth. The kind of truth that couldn't be faked, that came from a place deeper than technique or training. It reminded him of his own early days, singing in Birmingham's grimy pubs, pouring his hunger and anger into every note. He watched as Ethan's fingers moved across the strings, clumsy but determined, each chord a small act of defiance against a world that had tried to break him. The kid's eyes were closed now, his voice rising on the chorus. "I'm going off the rails on a crazy train." And Ozzy felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a cover. This was a cry, a story, a piece of someone's soul laid bare on the Sunset Strip. Ethan's life hadn't always been the streets. He remembered nights when he was 8, curled up on a couch in a cramped apartment, his mom humming old rock songs while she cooked. She'd loved Ozzy, loved the way his music felt like a rebellion against everything that tried to keep them down. But addiction had crept in, slow at first, then all-consuming, until she was a stranger who didn't come home. Ethan had tried to hold on, staying in school, keeping his grades up, but the foster system was a revolving door of temporary homes and broken promises. By 15, he'd had enough. He took his guitar and what little he owned and headed for LA, drawn to the Sunset Strip like a moth to a flame. He'd heard stories of musicians discovered here, of dreams born on these streets. But the reality was harsher. Nights spent shivering in doorways, days spent playing for pennies, and the constant fear that he'd disappear into the city's underbelly. Yet every time he picked up his guitar, he felt alive. Like he could still be someone. Like he could still matter. Ozzy watched as Ethan finished Crazy Train and transitioned into No More Tears, his voice softening but no less powerful. The crowd clapped, a few more coins clinking into the guitar case, but Ethan barely noticed. He was lost in the music, his fingers finding the notes through muscle memory, his heart carrying the melody. Ozzy's mind flashed back to his own youth, to the Birmingham slums where he'd sung to drown out the sound of his parents' fights, to the moment when someone, a club owner, a friend, had said, "You've got something, kid." That moment had changed everything. Now, standing here, he felt an urge he couldn't ignore. This kid wasn't just talented, he was hungry, in the way only someone who'd lived through hell could be. Ozzy pulled out his wallet, his fingers brushing against a $100 bill. It wasn't much, not in the grand scheme of things, but it was a start. He stepped forward, the crowd parting slightly, some recognizing the glint in his eyes even through the sunglasses. Ethan's voice faltered as he saw the bill flutter into his case, his eyes snapping open. $100 was a fortune, enough for a week of meals, maybe a night in a cheap motel. He looked up, ready to stammer a thank you, and froze. Even with the hoodie and sunglasses, there was no mistaking that face. The sharp cheekbones, the wild hair, the presence that filled the space around him. Ethan's hands shook, the guitar slipping slightly in his grip. "Keep playing, mate," the man said, his voice low, unmistakably British, unmistakably him. Ethan's heart pounded. This couldn't be real. He'd grown up listening to Ozzy's music, learning every riff, every lyric, as if they were a map to survival. And now, here he was, standing on the Sunset Strip, with Ozzy Osbourne looking at him like he was more than just a street kid. You're, Ethan stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The man grinned, a flash of teeth that was both warm and mischievous. "Just a guy who likes a good tune," he said, crouching down to Ethan's level. "What's your name, kid?" Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. Ethan Parker. He waited for the moment to break, for this to be a dream or a cruel joke, but Ozzy just nodded, like he was sizing him up. "You hungry, Ethan?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost gentle. Ethan nodded, too stunned to speak. Ozzy stood, glancing at the crowd that was starting to whisper, some pulling out their phones. "Come on then," he said, offering a hand. "Let's get you some food, and you can tell me how you learned to sing like that." Ethan scrambled to pack his guitar, his hands trembling as he scooped up the coins and the $100 bill, tucking them into his pocket like they might vanish. The crowd watched, some clapping, others murmuring as they realized who the man in the hoodie was. Ethan followed Ozzy across the street to a small diner called Rosie's, a place with chipped Formica tables and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. The owner, a woman named Maria with a warm smile and a no-nonsense attitude, waved them to a booth in the back. She knew Ozzy, had served him coffee in the '80s when he was just another wild-eyed musician with big dreams. Now, she didn't bat an eye as he slid into the booth across from a scrawny kid with a guitar case. Ethan sat, clutching the case like a shield, his mind racing. Ozzy leaned back, sunglasses off now, his eyes sharp but kind. "So, Ethan," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee, "tell me your story, and don't leave out the good bits." Ethan took a deep breath, the smell of burgers and fries filling the air, and started to talk. He told Ozzy about his mom, about the foster homes, about the nights when he'd played Crazy Train under a streetlight just to feel something other than fear. Ozzy listened, his face unreadable but his eyes locked on Ethan, taking in every word. As Ethan spoke, Ozzy saw himself in the kid's story, the hunger, the loneliness, the music that kept him going when nothing else did. He remembered his own nights on the streets, before Black Sabbath, before fame, when he was just John Osbourne, a kid with a voice and a dream. Ethan's voice, when he sang, had that same fire, that same desperate need to be heard. Ozzy didn't know what he was going to do next, not exactly, but he knew he couldn't walk away. Not from this. "You know what I hear when you sing?" Ozzy said, leaning forward, his voice low and serious. "I hear someone who's lived it. You can't fake that, Ethan. You've got something real." Ethan stared at him, his burger untouched, his heart pounding. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ozzy grinned, that wild, reckless grin that had made him a legend. "Now, kid, we see what you can do with a proper mic. You ever been in a studio?" Ethan shook his head, his eyes wide. "Then finish that burger," Ozzy said, tossing a napkin across the table. "We've got work to do." The studio smelled of old wood, cigarette smoke, and dreams, both the ones that had come true and the ones that had crumbled under the weight of reality. Tucked away on a quiet side street in Hollywood, the building was unassuming from the outside, its faded brick facade blending into the urban sprawl of Los Angeles. But inside, it was a cathedral of sound, its walls lined with soundproof foam and history, where legends had carved their names into the fabric of rock and roll. Ethan Parker stood in the doorway, his battered guitar case clutched tightly in one hand, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. The Sunset Strip, with its chaos and grit, felt a world away, though it was only a few blocks. Yesterday, he'd been Stringer, the street kid scraping by on coins and hope, singing Ozzy Osbourne's Crazy Train for strangers who barely looked at him. Now, he was here, in a place he'd only dreamed of, invited by the man himself. Ozzy stood beside him, his hoodie swapped for a black leather jacket, sunglasses still shielding his eyes, though the glint of excitement in them was unmistakable. "Welcome to the big leagues, kid," Ozzy said, clapping a hand on Ethan's shoulder. The weight of that hand, the casual confidence in Ozzy's voice, made Ethan feel both anchored and adrift, like he was standing on the edge of something he couldn't fully comprehend. The studio was alive with activity. Roadies hauling cables, engineers tweaking knobs on a mixing board that looked like it belonged in a spaceship, and a handful of session musicians lounging on worn leather couches, their instruments resting like old friends. They were older, grizzled, with tattoos and stories etched into their skin, and they eyed Ethan with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. A kid off the street, brought in by Ozzy Osbourne? They'd seen stranger things, but not by much. Ethan's Black Sabbath t-shirt and two big jeans felt like a costume now, inadequate for this sacred space. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and followed Ozzy into the heart of the studio. The control room was a glass-walled sanctuary, filled with blinking lights and screens that glowed with waveforms. Beyond the glass, the recording booth waited, a small room with a microphone stand that seemed to loom like a judge. Ozzy gestured toward it, his grin wide and a little wild. "That's your spot, Ethan. Let's see what you've got when you're not fighting traffic noise." Ethan's stomach churned. He'd played for crowds before. Drunk tourists, distracted locals, even the occasional cop who'd tell him to move along. But this was different. These were professionals, people who'd backed up legends, who knew what real talent sounded like. What if he choked? What if his voice, so raw and free on the street, sounded small and hollow in here? He glanced at Ozzy, searching for a sign that this was a mistake. But Ozzy's expression was unyielding, a mix of encouragement and expectation. "You're not here to impress them," Ozzy said, as if reading his mind. "You're here to be you. That's enough." Ethan nodded, though he didn't believe it. Not yet. He set his guitar case down, his fingers trembling as he unzipped it. The guitar inside was the same battered one he'd played on the Strip, its scratches and dents a map of his survival. He slung the strap over his shoulder, the familiar weight grounding him, and stepped into the booth. Inside, the air was cool and still, the silence so thick it felt like a physical thing. Ethan adjusted the microphone, his hands clumsy, and glanced through the glass at the control room. Ozzy was there, leaning against the mixing board, talking to a producer named Jack. A wiry man with a gray ponytail and a reputation for coaxing magic out of chaos. The session musicians, a drummer with a shaved head, a bassist with a cigarette tucked behind his ear, and a keyboardist who looked like he hadn't slept in a decade, were tuning their instruments, their movements casual but precise. Ethan's chest tightened. He'd never played with a band before, never had anything but his own chords to lean on. Jack's voice crackled through the booth's speakers. "All right, kid, let's start with something you know. Ozzy says you're a fan, so how about No More Tears?" Ethan's eyes widened. It was one of his favorites, a song he'd sung 100 times under streetlights, its heavy riffs and aching melody, a perfect fit for his voice. He nodded, his throat too tight to speak, and strummed the opening chord. The sound was clean, amplified by the studio's equipment, and it sent a shiver down his spine. He closed his eyes, the way he always did when he sang, and let the music take over. The first note was tentative, his voice softer than he meant it to be. But as the lyrics came, "No more tears, no more tears," something shifted. The booth disappeared, the studio faded, and he was back on the strip, singing for his life, for the kid he'd been, for the mother who'd left him. His voice grew stronger, raw and unpolished, but filled with a pain that hit like a tidal wave. Outside the booth, the musicians exchanged glances, their skepticism giving way to surprise. The drummer picked up the beat, his sticks a steady pulse that matched Ethan's rhythm. The bassist joined in, his low notes weaving a foundation under Ethan's guitar. The keyboardist added a haunting layer, the chords echoing the song's melancholy. Ethan didn't hear them, not consciously, but he felt them, their music lifting his voice higher, giving it wings. He sang like he was confessing, like every word was a piece of himself he'd kept hidden too long. "The light in the window is a crack in the sky," he sang, his voice breaking on the high notes, not from weakness, but from the weight of everything he carried. When he reached the chorus, the band kicked in fully, the sound swelling until it filled the booth, the studio, the world. Ethan's eyes stayed closed, his fingers flying across the strings, and for those few minutes, he wasn't a street kid. He was a voice, a story, a force. When the song ended, the silence was deafening. Ethan opened his eyes, his breath ragged, and looked through the glass. The musicians were staring, their instruments still, their faces unreadable. Jack, the producer, leaned into the mic, his voice dry but warm. "Well, damn, kid, that was something." Ozzy was grinning, his sunglasses off now, his eyes bright with something Ethan couldn't name. Pride, maybe, or recognition. He clapped his hands, the sound sharp in the quiet. "Told you lot he's got it," Ozzy said, his voice carrying that Birmingham growl. "That's not just singing, that's living." Ethan's cheeks burned, his heart racing with a mix of relief and disbelief. He'd done it. He hadn't choked. But the weight of the moment pressed down on him, the realization that this wasn't just a one-off, that Ozzy had brought him here for a reason. He stepped out of the booth, his legs shaky, and Ozzy met him at the door. "You feel that?" Ozzy asked, his voice low, almost reverent. "That's what it's supposed to feel like you're bleeding, but it's worth it." Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure he understood, not fully. He felt raw, exposed, like he'd just ripped his chest open and shown the world what was inside. The rest of the session was a blur. They ran through No More Tears again, then tried Mama, I'm Coming Home, another song Ethan knew by heart. Each time, the band pushed him, challenged him, their music sharpening his own. He made mistakes, missed cues, fumbled chords, but they didn't laugh or roll their eyes. They nodded, adjusted, kept going, like they were starting to see him as one of them. Between takes, Ozzy pulled him aside, his voice quiet but firm. "You're not just some kid I found on the street, Ethan. You've got something most people never find, but you've got to trust it." Trust me. Ethan wanted to, more than anything, but trust was a muscle he hadn't used in years. His mind flashed to the foster homes, the promises that always ended in disappointment, the social workers who'd said they'd help, only to send him to another house where he didn't belong, the mother who'd loved him once, then left him with nothing but a guitar and a note. He looked at Ozzy, at the lines etched into his face, the scars of a life lived hard, and saw something he hadn't expected: understanding. Ozzy knew what it was to be lost, to fight for a place in a world that didn't care. "I'm trying," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ozzy nodded, his hand resting on Ethan's shoulder again. "That's enough for now." As the session wound down, Jack called Ethan back into the control room. The producer played back a rough mix of "No More Tears," and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His voice, backed by the band, sounded bigger, fuller, like it belonged to someone else, someone who mattered. He heard the pain in it, the hunger, but also something new: strength. He glanced at Ozzy, who was leaning back in a chair, his boots propped on the mixing board. "What do you think, kid?" Ozzy asked, his grin sly but warm. Ethan didn't know how to answer. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath him, but instead of falling, he was flying. "It's real," he said finally, the only word that felt right. Ozzy laughed, a rough, joyful sound. "Damn right it is, and we're just getting started." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Ethan's. "You've got a story to tell, mate. Not just with my songs, but with your own. You write, don't you?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. He'd scribbled lyrics in a battered notebook he kept in his backpack, words that came to him in the quiet of the night, when the city was asleep, and he was alone with his thoughts. "Good," Ozzy said, standing up. "Bring 'em next time. I want to hear what Stringer's got to say." Ethan left the studio that evening with his head spinning, the weight of the day settling into his bones. The sun was setting over Hollywood, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel the familiar knot of fear in his stomach. Ozzy had given him a card with an address, a friend's place, he'd said, where Ethan could crash for the night. "No more sleeping on the street," Ozzy had told him, his voice firm. "You're too good for that." Ethan clutched the card, his guitar case bumping against his leg as he walked. The city felt different now, not softer, but sharper, like it was waiting for him to... The streets of Los Angeles never slept. Not really. Even in the early hours, when the tourists had stumbled back to their hotels and the neon signs flickered like tired eyelids, the city hummed with a restless energy. Ethan Parker, still known as Stringer to the scattered souls who shared his world, walked the familiar pavement of the Sunset Strip, his guitar case slung over his shoulder. The weight of it was comforting, a reminder of who he was, even as everything else seemed to shift beneath his feet. It had been a week since his day in the studio with Ozzy Osbourne, a week since his voice had filled that sacred space. Backed by musicians who'd played with legends, the memory felt like a dream, vivid but fragile, as if it might slip away if he didn't hold it tight. He was still sleeping at the address Ozzy had given him, a small apartment above a record store owned by a friend of Ozzy's named Carla, a woman with a gravelly voice and a heart too big for her own good. She'd given him a couch, a hot meal, and no questions, just a quiet nod that said she understood what it was to need a break. But the streets still called to Ethan, not out of necessity now, but out of habit, a pull he couldn't quite shake. He needed to feel the asphalt under his boots, the pulse of the city in his bones, to remind himself that he was still Stringer, even if Ozzy saw something more. Tonight, the Strip was quieter than usual. the air thick with the threat of rain. Ethan found his old spot outside the Rusty Anchor, the dive bar where Ozzy had first heard him play. The graffiti on the brick wall was the same, the cracks in the sidewalk unchanged, but Ethan felt different, raw, exposed, like the studio had peeled back a layer of his skin. He set down his guitar case, opened it, and pulled out his battered instrument. A few coins glinted inside, remnants of his last busking session, but money wasn't why he was here. He needed to play, to let the music anchor him in a world that felt too big, too fast. He strummed the opening chords of City of Shadows, a song he'd written months ago, when the streets were his only home. The lyrics came from nights spent watching the city move past him, a blur of lights and faces that never stopped to see him. "Shadows fall where the street lights fade," he sang, his voice low and steady. "Dreams get lost in the price you've paid." The words were his truth, carved from hunger and loneliness, but also from the small moments of grace. A stranger's smile, a dollar dropped in his case, a song that made him feel alive. He didn't notice the small crowd gathering, didn't see the girl with the tangled blonde hair and patched jacket standing at the edge, her eyes fixed on him like he was the only thing in the world. Her name was Lila, and she was a fixture on the strip, a 17-year-old runaway who sang for spare change a few blocks down. Ethan knew her the way you know people on the street, not deeply, but enough to nod, to share a cigarette or a story when the nights got too long. Lila had a voice like broken glass, sharp and beautiful, but she was drowning, her eyes hollow from the drugs she couldn't quit. Ethan had seen her play, heard the way her voice could stop a crowd, but he'd also seen her shaking in alleys, chasing a high that never lasted. Tonight, she looked cleaner, steadier, her hands stuffed in her pockets as she listened. When Ethan finished City of Shadows, she stepped forward, her boots scuffing the pavement. "That's new," she said, her voice rough but warm. "You write that?" Ethan nodded, surprised she'd noticed. "Yeah, just something I've been messing with." Lila tilted her head, studying him. "It's good, Stringer. Real good. You sound different." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "Just trying something." Lila's lips twitched, almost a smile. "You're not just trying. You're going somewhere, aren't you?" Her words hit harder than he expected, stirring a mix of pride and guilt. He was going somewhere, maybe, because Ozzy had seen something in him. But Lila was still here, still fighting the same fight he'd been fighting a week ago. He didn't know how to answer, so he just nodded, his fingers brushing the strings. Back at Carla's apartment, Ethan couldn't sleep. The couch was soft, the room warm, but his mind was restless, replaying Lila's words, the studio, Ozzy's voice telling him to trust. He pulled out his notebook, its pages creased and smudged, and read over City of Shadows again. The song was raw, unpolished, but it was his, every line a piece of the life he'd lived. He wondered what Ozzy would think of it, if it could stand up to the songs they'd recorded in the studio. The next day, he was back at the studio, the air humming with the same electric energy. Ozzy was there, sprawled in a chair in the control room. His boots on the mixing board, a coffee cup balanced precariously on his knee. "All right, mate," he said, his grin sharp. "You brought something for me?" Ethan hesitated, his notebook heavy in his hands. He'd never shown anyone his songs, not really, but Ozzy's eyes were steady, expectant, like he already knew what Ethan was capable of. "Yeah," Ethan said finally, his voice quiet. "It's called City of Shadows. It's mine." Ozzy's grin widened. "That's what I like to hear. Let's get it on tape." The session musicians were there again, the same grizzled crew from last time, but their skepticism had softened, replaced by a cautious respect. Ethan stepped into the booth, his guitar in hand, and explained the song's structure. Simple chords, a steady rhythm, nothing fancy. The drummer, a guy named Rico, with a scar across his knuckles, nodded thoughtfully. "Got a bluesy vibe," he said. "Let's lean into it." Ethan took a deep breath, his fingers finding the familiar chords, and started to sing. "Shadows fall where the streetlights fade." His voice was different in the studio, clearer, stronger, but it still carried the weight of the streets, the ache of nights spent wondering if he'd ever be more than a ghost in the city. The band joined in, their instruments weaving around his voice, adding depth to the melody. The bassist, a quiet woman named Tara, found a groove that matched the song's heartbeat, while the keyboardist, Leo, added a haunting layer of chords that made Ethan's skin prickle. He closed his eyes, letting the music take him back to the Strip, to the nights when he'd sung to keep the darkness at bay. When he finished, the booth was silent, the band's instruments fading into a hush. Ethan opened his eyes, his breath uneven, and looked through the glass. Ozzy was leaning forward, his sunglasses off, his eyes bright with something that looked like awe. Jack, the producer, was nodding, his fingers tapping the mixing board. "That's a song, kid," Jack said, his voice gruff but warm. "That's a damn song." Ozzy stood, pacing the control room like a caged animal, his energy crackling. "Ethan, that's not just good. It's real. It's got soul. You know what I'm thinking?" Ethan shook his head, his heart pounding. Ozzy stopped, his grin wild. "I'm thinking we record it, you and me, a duet." Ethan's jaw dropped, his mind struggling to process the words. A duet with Ozzy Osbourne? It was unthinkable, like something out of a fever dream. "You serious?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ozzy laughed, a rough, joyful sound. "Dead serious, mate. Your voice, my voice, that song, it's gonna hit people where it hurts." The rest of the day was spent laying down tracks for City of Shadows. Ethan sang first, his voice raw and unfiltered, each line a piece of his life poured into the mic. Then Ozzy stepped into the booth, his presence filling the room like a storm. His voice was different, seasoned, powerful, with that unmistakable edge that had defined a generation. But when it blended with Ethan's, something magical happened. Their voices wove together, Ethan's raw pain meeting Ozzy's weathered intensity, creating a sound that was both timeless and new. The band pushed harder, their instruments driving the song to new heights, and Ethan felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. Something that could reach beyond the studio, beyond the Strip, beyond the life he'd known. When they finished, the control room erupted in applause, Rico pounding his fist on the couch, Tara giving a rare smile. Jack played back the track, and Ethan listened, his breath catching as he heard their voices together, his story married to Ozzy's legend. It was perfect, not polished, not clean, but perfect in its honesty. Outside the studio, the city was waking up, the sky turning a bruised purple as the sun sank low. Ethan sat on the curb, his guitar case beside him, trying to make sense of the day. Ozzy joined him, lighting a cigarette and exhaling a cloud of smoke into the air. "You all right, kid?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost gentle. Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure he was. The duet, the studio, the song, it was all too much. Too fast. He thought about Lila, about her hollow eyes and her broken glass voice, about how she was still out there, fighting a battle he'd only just escaped. "I've got a friend," he said suddenly, the words spilling out before he could stop them. Her name's Lila. She sings, too. She's good, but she's stuck, you know? Ozzy took a drag on his cigarette, his eyes narrowing. Stuck how? Ethan hesitated, then told him about Lila, about her voice, her addiction, the way she'd listened to City of Shadows like it was her story too. Ozzy listened, his face unreadable, then nodded. Bring her by, he said simply. If she's got half the heart you do, she's worth hearing. Ethan's chest tightened, a mix of gratitude and fear. He wanted to help Lila, but he knew trust was fragile, especially for someone like her. He thought about his own trust, how hard it was to let Ozzy in, to believe this wasn't just another promise that would break. That night, Ethan found Lila at her usual spot, a corner near a pawn shop where she played for late-night stragglers. She was singing Dreamer, her voice cutting through the hum of the city, and Ethan stopped, listening the way Ozzy had listened to him. When she finished, he approached, his hands stuffed in his pockets. You ever think about recording? He asked, his voice casual, but his eyes serious. Lila laughed, a bitter sound. Yeah, right. Who's gonna give a junkie like me a shot? Ethan flinched, but he didn't back down. Someone gave me one, he said. Come with me tomorrow. Just try. Lila looked at him, her eyes searching for a catch, but all she saw was Stringer, the kid who'd shared her streets, who knew what it was to have nothing. She nodded, a small, hesitant movement, and Ethan felt a spark of hope, not just for himself, but for her. As he walked back to Carla's, the city around him buzzing with life, he thought about City of Shadows, about how it wasn't just his song anymore. It was Lila's, Ozzy's, maybe everyone's who'd ever felt lost in the shadows of the world. And for the first time, he believed he could be more than a ghost. He could be a voice, one that carried others with it. The small venue on Melrose Avenue pulsed with a quiet electricity, its dim lights casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. The place was called the Black Cat, a hole-in-the-wall club that had seen its share of dreamers and drunks, where the walls were plastered with faded posters of bands long forgotten and a few that had made it big. Tonight, it was packed, the air thick with anticipation and the faint smell of beer and sweat. Ethan Parker stood backstage, his hands gripping the neck of a new guitar, a sleek, black Fender that Ozzy had insisted he use, a gift that felt too heavy for what it meant. The instrument gleamed under the stage lights, its strings catching the glow like they were made of starlight, a far cry from the battered relic he'd played on the Sunset Strip. He was still Stringer deep down, but the boy who'd busked for coins felt like a ghost now, fading into the edges of this new life. It had been months since that humid afternoon when Ozzy Osbourne had stopped to listen. Months since the studio sessions that had turned City of Shadows into a duet that was climbing the charts, its raw honesty resonating with anyone who'd ever felt lost. Ethan was no longer sleeping on the streets, thanks to Carla's couch and, later, a small apartment Ozzy had helped him secure through a friend in the music business. He had a recording contract now, a deal with a label that saw him not as Ozzy's protege, but as Ethan Parker, an artist with a voice that could cut through the noise. Tonight was his first real showcase, a chance to play City of Shadows, and a handful of new songs for a crowd that included industry insiders, fans, and, somewhere in the shadows, Ozzy himself. Ethan's stomach churned, not from nerves, but from the weight of everything that had brought him here. He adjusted the strap of his guitar, his fingers brushing the strings, and took a deep breath, trying to ground himself in the music that had always been his anchor. Backstage was a maze of cables and crates, the air filled with the low hum of conversation and the occasional clink of glass. Ethan caught a glimpse of Lila in the corner, her blonde hair pulled back, her eyes clearer than he'd ever seen them. She'd come to the studio a month ago, hesitant and guarded, but her voice had stunned everyone, even Jack, the producer, who rarely got excited about anything. Lila was in recovery now, living at a halfway house Ozzy had connected her with, her days structured around meetings and music. She wasn't performing tonight. Her time would come. Ethan was sure of it. But she was here. Her presence a quiet reminder of the streets they'd both survived. Ethan had been mentoring her, sharing the chords to City of Shadows, teaching her how to let her pain fuel her music the way he'd learned to. "You're gonna kill it," Lila said, stepping closer, her voice rough but warm. She wore a clean denim jacket, a far cry from the patched mess she'd had on the strip, and her smile was small but real. "You nervous?" Ethan shrugged, his lips twitching. "Not nervous, just feels like a lot." Lila nodded, understanding in a way only someone who'd lived their life could. "You deserve this, Stringer. Don't forget that." He met her eyes, seeing the girl who'd sung Dreamer under a pawn shop's neon sign, and felt a surge of gratitude. He wasn't just here for himself tonight. He was here for her, for everyone who'd ever felt invisible. The stage manager, a burly guy named Tony with a clipboard and a permanent scowl, waved Ethan toward the stage. "You're up, kid," he said, his voice softened by a grudging respect. Ethan nodded, his boots heavy as he walked toward the curtain. The crowd's murmur grew louder, a sea of faces waiting in the dim light. He could see them through a gap in the curtain. College kids in band t-shirts, industry types with notepads, a few older fans who'd probably seen Ozzy in his Black Sabbath days. Somewhere out there, Ozzy was watching, his presence a quiet force that Ethan could feel without seeing. He thought about the first time he'd met him, the $100 bill fluttering into his guitar case, the diner where he'd poured out his story. He thought about the studio, the way their voices had blended in City of Shadows, creating something neither could have done alone. And he thought about his mom, wherever she was, wondering if she'd ever hear him, if she'd know the boy she'd left behind had found a way to be heard. The house lights dimmed, the crowd's chatter fading into a hush. And Ethan stepped onto the stage, the spotlight hot on his face. He stood alone for a moment, just him and the guitar, the silence stretching like a held breath. Then he strummed the first chord of City of Shadows, the sound clean and sharp, filling the room with a weight that made the air feel heavier. "Shadows fall where the streetlights fade," he sang, his voice steady but raw, each word carrying the nights he'd spent on the strip, the hunger, the loneliness, the hope that had kept him going. The crowd was quiet at first, leaning in, caught by the honesty in his voice. He closed his eyes, the way he always did, letting the music take him back to those street corners, to the moments when he'd sung to feel alive. But this time, he wasn't alone. The band joined in, a drummer, a bassist, a keyboardist, not the same ones from the studio, but just as skilled, their instruments weaving around his voice like a safety net. The song built, its rhythm steady but urgent, and Ethan felt it in his chest, a fire that burned brighter with every note. When he reached the chorus, "I'm still here screaming in the dark," the crowd came alive, their cheers rising like a wave, and Ethan opened his eyes, startled by the sound. He saw faces, not just a blur, but individuals, kids like him, dreamers, survivors, all of them listening, really listening. As the song ended, the applause was deafening, a roar that shook the walls of the Black Cat. Ethan stood there, his breath uneven, his heart pounding, and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just a performance, it was a moment, one that would stay with him forever. He played 2 more songs, both originals from his notebook, their lyrics raw and unpolished, but full of truth. The crowd stayed with him, their energy feeding his, and by the time he reached the final song, he knew what he had to do. He leaned into the mic, his voice softer now, almost conversational. "This last one's for someone who changed everything," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd, searching for Ozzy. "A guy who stopped to listen when no one else did. This is for you, Ozzy, and for everyone who's ever needed someone to believe in them." The crowd cheered, some shouting Ozzy's name, and Ethan started "City of Shadows" again, this time as a solo, just him and the guitar. His voice was quieter, more intimate, but no less powerful. Each line a thank you, a promise, a reflection of the journey that had brought him here. He thought about Ozzy's own story, the way he'd talked about Randy Rhoads, the guitarist who'd believed in him when he was just a kid from Birmingham with a voice and a dream. He thought about Lila, fighting her way back from the edge, her voice waiting to be heard. And he thought about himself, the boy who'd been invisible, now standing in a spotlight, his music reaching people he'd never met. When the song ended, the crowd was on its feet, their applause a tidal wave that washed over him. Ethan stood there, his guitar still in his hands, and felt tears prick his eyes, not from sadness, but from something deeper, something he couldn't name. He saw Lila in the wings, clapping, her smile wide and real. He saw Carla in the crowd, her arms crossed, but her eyes shining with pride. And then he saw Ozzy, near the back, his leather jacket unmistakable, his grin wide and wild. Ozzy raised a hand, a small salute, and Ethan nodded back, a silent understanding passing between them. He left the stage, his legs shaky but his heart steady, and Lila was there, pulling him into a hug. "You did it, Stringer," she whispered, her voice thick. "You made it." Ethan shook his head, his voice low. "Not yet. But I'm getting there, and you're coming with me." Lila laughed, a sound that was half sob, half joy, and Ethan knew she'd heard him, really heard him, the way Ozzy had heard him that first day. Later, as the crowd thinned and the venue quieted, Ethan found Ozzy outside, leaning against a wall, a cigarette glowing in the dark. "You were good out there, kid," Ozzy said, his voice rough but warm. "Real good." Ethan shrugged, still uncomfortable with praise. "I just sang what I know." Ozzy took a drag, his eyes distant, like he was seeing something beyond the city lights. "That's all any of us do," he said. "Sing what we know, hope someone listens. You made 'em listen tonight." Ethan looked at him, the man who'd changed his life, and felt a question rise in his chest. "Why'd you do it?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Why'd you stop that day, on the strip?" Ozzy was silent for a moment, his cigarette burning down to ash. Then he looked at Ethan, his eyes steady. "Because someone stopped for me once. A bloke named Randy, a few others along the way. They saw something in me when I was nothing but a kid with a voice. I heard that in you, Ethan. I heard a kid who needed someone to say, 'You're enough.'" Ethan's throat tightened, and he nodded, unable to speak. Ozzy flicked his cigarette away, the embers sparking on the pavement. "Keep singing, mate. Not for me. Not for them. For you. That's what matters." Ethan walked back to his apartment that night, the city alive around him, its lights brighter than he remembered. He thought about Lila, about the songs they'd write together, about the kids still on the streets, playing for coins, hoping for a chance. He thought about Ozzy, about Randy Rhoads, about the chain of belief that stretched back through time, each person lifting up the next. He didn't need to say it out loud, didn't need to spell it out. The truth was in his music, in the way he'd stood on that stage, in the way he'd reached out to Lila, in the way Ozzy had reached out to him. The real magic wasn't in the spotlight or the applause. It was in the moment when one person saw another, really saw them, and decided to act. As he unlocked his door, the guitar case bumping against his leg, Ethan felt that magic in his bones, a quiet promise that he'd carry it forward, that he'd listen, that he'd stop for someone else one day. The city hummed outside, its shadows softer now, and Ethan knew for the first time in his life that he wasn't just surviving. He was building something real, something that could echo far beyond the streets he'd once called home.